In the dim hush of the Chicago Historical Society's archives, dust and silence had been companions for decades. Then, one quiet morning in 2019, a simple act of cataloging stirred something long forgotten. Beneath layers of time and neglect, a mystery had been waiting, hidden in plain sight, for nearly 90 years. What seemed at first to be just another photograph from the Great Depression would soon unravel a secret that threatened to rewrite everything historians thought they knew about one of America's darkest decades. This is the story of a single suitcase, a forgotten photograph, and a man whose desperate journey across a fractured nation would expose a web of corruption, reaching the highest corners of power. When modern technology met a grainy image from 1930, the past began to whisper again, and the results were nothing short of astonishing. But before we step into this haunting tale of discovery, secrecy, and endurance, take a moment to settle in. Subscribe if you wish and keep your mind open. Because tonight, we follow the faint trail of a man history tried to erase. It was the morning of October 15th, 2019. An ordinary day for Sarah Chen, a digital archivist at the Chicago Historical Society. The autumn air outside Grant Park carried the soft breath of coming winter as she made her way toward the massive limestone building that held the memory of a nation. Her task that day seemed simple enough to scan and preserve thousands of Depression-era photographs as part of a vast digitization effort. The images were familiar breadlines, soup kitchens, weary faces turned toward invisible hopes. Then she opened Box 247C. Most of the pictures were predictable echoes of despair already etched into history. But photograph number 3347 was different. Sarah couldn't say why not yet. The image showed a man mid-40s, thin-faced, dressed in clothes that had once been fine. He stood before Union Station, clutching a leather suitcase tight to his chest. It was his eyes that stopped her. There was something in them, a glint of fear or perhaps resolve that reached across 90 years of silence. The back of the photo bore only a faint note in pencil. Unknown, Man Station, Chicago, September 1930. Photographer James Morrison. But when Sarah began enhancing the image, the story deepened. As the pixels sharpened and the shadows fell away, faint lines of text began to emerge on the side of the man's suitcase, words lost to time, now glowing back into existence. They read E. Rothschild. Evidence. Federal Reserve. Sarah's breath caught. Beneath the name, more words appeared. Sept. 1929. Insider trading documents. Hands trembling, she called for her supervisor, Dr. Margaret Walsh, a historian who had devoted 30 years to studying the Great Depression. When Dr. Walsh saw the screen, she drew closer, whispering, as though afraid the past might overhear. My God, if this is what I think it is, then we're looking at proof of something long dismissed as rumor. The name Rothschild carried weight among Depression-era scholars. Edward Rothschild, an employee at the Federal Reserve Bank of Chicago, had vanished in 1930, just a year after the crash. Some said he fled with stolen funds. Others believed he lost his mind and ended his life. But what if the truth was far more dangerous? Dr. Walsh began to dig. She reached out to the National Archives, the Federal Reserve's historical office, even retired FBI agents who once specialized in financial crimes of the era. and slowly from the yellowed files and forgotten reports, a pattern began to take shape. A trail of suspicious deaths, vanished names and stories that no one had ever dared to connect until now. The deeper Dr. Walsh and Sarah searched the stranger, the story became. Their investigation soon led them to a quiet nursing home on Chicago's north side where time seemed to move a little slower and memories lingered like dust in sunlight. There they met Clara Morrison, 94 years old, daughter of the photographer James Morrison, the very man who had taken the photograph that started it all. Clara's eyes, still clear despite her age, widened the instant she saw the enhanced image. Recognition flashed first, then fear. "I remember that man," she whispered, her voice thin as paper. "My father talked about him for years afterward. Said he wished he'd never taken that picture." Her father, she explained, had been a freelance photographer documenting the weary faces of the Great Depression for newspapers that could barely afford to pay him. On September 23, 1930, James Morrison had been at Union Station capturing the endless tide of desperate men spilling into Chicago, searching for work. Then a stranger approached him. The man with the suitcase. He said he needed someone to document what he was carrying. Clara murmured, fingers trembling on the edge of the photo in case something happened to him. Her father had assumed the man feared thieves. People were desperate in those days. Robbery was common. But when the stranger pressed a $20 bill into his hand, more than a month's wages, James Morrison hesitated only a moment before taking the photograph. The man promised to return for it. He never did. Within a week, 2 men in tailored suits appeared at the Morrison home. They claimed to be federal agents. Their words were polite, but their tone was not. They demanded every copy of the photograph showing the man with the suitcase. James lied. He told them the film had been ruined, but he had hidden it, instead tucked it away where no one would ever find it. Not until decades later, after his death in 1967, when Clara donated his entire collection to the Historical Society. It was that hidden relic forgotten for almost 90 years that had found its way into Sarah's hands. The next breakthrough came quietly. Dr. Walsh's contact at the National Archives uncovered a classified FBI file dated 1930, sealed away for 89 years. Inside was a name that sent a chill through the room: Edward Rothschild. The file described an investigation into insider trading and market manipulation during the months leading up to the 1929 crash. Rothschild had worked as a clerk in the Federal Reserve's research department. According to the documents, he had stumbled across private correspondence between high-ranking Federal Reserve officials and powerful Wall Street firms. The letters suggested something unthinkable: that certain institutions had been warned about policy shifts that would soon devastate the market. Armed with that knowledge, they'd quietly moved their assets, shielding themselves from the disaster that would ruin millions. Could it be that the great crash, the tragedy that shattered so many lives, had been not only foreseen but used? Dr. Walsh and Sarah pressed further. Railway records showed that on September 24, 1930, a ticket had been purchased under the name E. Rogers for a train from Chicago to Denver, one day after the Union Station photograph was taken. In Denver, another clue emerged. A Denver Post reporter named Thomas Bradley had written in his personal notes, found only decades later, about a frightened man carrying a leather suitcase. the man claimed to have evidence of corruption reaching all the way to Washington. They were supposed to meet again. Rothschild never appeared. The trail might have ended there if not for a small article buried in the Rocky Mountain News dated October 8, 1930. A man's body had been found in the hills outside Denver. The cause apparent robbery. The remains were too decomposed to identify. Among the missing possessions was a distinctive leather suitcase. The details were too close to ignore. As Dr. Walsh sifted through the past, a grim pattern began to form, a series of deaths and disappearances between September 1930 and January 1931, all connected to the Federal Reserve or major financial firms. Each person had, in the weeks before they vanished, been described as anxious, distracted, speaking of things they shouldn't have known. And then there was Rothschild's own personnel file, obtained through a Freedom of Information Act request. There, in a supervisor's neat handwriting, dated September 1929, just 1 month before the crash, was a simple note. Rothschild has been asking inappropriate questions regarding correspondence with member banks. Reassigned to less sensitive duties. It was a single line. But in that quiet sentence, the shadow of an enormous secret seemed to stir. The timing was impossible to ignore. Every new discovery drew the circle tighter around a truth that no one had ever dared to face. In the official records of 1930, investigators had searched Edward Rothschild's apartment shortly after he vanished. What they found was unsettling. Papers, notes, fragments of coded messages, all suggesting that Rothschild had been collecting information for months. His landlord later told police that Rothschild had grown anxious, jumpy. The phone would ring late at night. He'd answer in whispers, then hang up abruptly. He told me someone was trying to keep him quiet. The landlord's statement read. He said he had something that could bring down some very powerful people. And then he was gone. The modern investigation took a darker turn when Sarah Chen unearthed several more photographs from James Morrison's old collection. At first glance, they looked ordinary faces of men in crowded Chicago streets, all carrying suitcases. But as Sarah began the digital enhancement, the pattern revealed itself. Each suitcase carried faint, ghostly letters, words that had been invisible for nearly a century. One read, Morgan Communications, 1929. Another Treasury Debt, internal memos, crash prediction. The implications were staggering. These weren't isolated snapshots. They were fragments of a hidden network men who had risked everything to move and preserve evidence of financial corruption at the heart of America's economy. Could it be that Rothschild hadn't acted alone? That there were others, quiet witnesses scattered across the country, trying to expose what they believed was a vast conspiracy buried beneath the wreckage of the Great Depression? Dr. Walsh and her team cast their net wider, reaching into dusty archives from New York to Boston, searching for echoes of the same story. In New York, they found the name Margaret Stevens, a secretary at J.P. Morgan & Co.'s who disappeared in November 1930 after allegedly copying confidential letters between the firm and Federal Reserve officials. In Boston, an economics professor named Dr. James Patterson had been researching the government's role in the crash. He was killed in a car accident in December 1930, just days before he was to present his findings to colleagues. One by one, names surfaced and then dissolved into silence, each one tied to whispers of missing documents, suppressed evidence, unfinished reports. And then, unexpectedly, the past reached out to them. Dr. Walsh received a phone call from Robert Chensara's great-uncle, a 91-year-old retired postal worker who had been quietly following the story in the news. "My father told me stories," he said softly when they met in her office. He worked as a courier for the Federal Reserve back in the 30s. He said there were documents that disappeared, and people who asked too many questions. Some of them ended up dead. He made me promise not to tell anyone until he was gone. Robert's father had seen Edward Rothschild himself late at night in the echoing halls of the Federal Reserve building. He said Rothschild stayed after hours copying papers when he thought no one was watching. But people did notice, and word got to the higher-ups. According to him, Rothschild wasn't alone. There was a small circle of employees, quiet, watchful, who had begun to suspect that the timing of the Federal Reserve's policy shifts wasn't coincidence at all. Then came the most shocking revelation of all. From his coat pocket, Robert drew a yellowed envelope, edges worn with time. Inside was a letter written in Rothschild's own hand, dated September 22nd, 1930. He said his father had hidden it for decades, terrified of what it meant. The letter began simply, "The American people deserve to know the truth." In it, Rothschild claimed he possessed documents proving that officials within the Federal Reserve had shared confidential information with select Wall Street firms, allowing them to shield themselves, even profit from the economic collapse that would devastate the rest of the nation. What happened in October 1929, Rothschild wrote, was not just a correction or a failure of speculation. It was a deliberate act by those who knew exactly what they were doing and who stood to gain from the chaos that followed. I have the documents to prove it, and I am willing to risk everything to make sure this truth sees the light of day. The words trailed off into silence. The ink faded but defiant, and in that silence, Dr. Walsh realized they weren't just chasing a mystery. They were following the faint heartbeat of a man who had tried to warn the world and paid the ultimate price for doing so. The letter had never been delivered. Robert's father, haunted by the fates of others who had dared to ask dangerous questions, hid it away instead. He had a family to think about, Robert said softly. He couldn't risk what happened to Rothschild happening to him. As Dr. Walsh's investigation neared its end, the weight of it all began to press upon her. The evidence they'd uncovered pointed to a scale of corruption and conspiracy that could reshape the history of the Great Depression. But it also implicated names, families, banks, and institutions that still held enormous power. If they released their findings, what would follow? Vindication, outrage, or something darker? It was then that the final piece of the puzzle came from a voice out of the past. Dr. Walsh received a call from the great-grandson of Thomas Bradley, the Denver reporter who had once been scheduled to meet Edward Rothschild. The family, while sorting through their ancestor's old desk, had found a hidden compartment inside a bundle of aging papers, wrapped in twine and silence. Among them were documents that appeared to be a partial copy of the contents of Rothschild's suitcase, Federal Reserve communications memos between officials and Wall Street executives, and detailed transaction records from the days leading up to the 1929 crash. If they were authentic, they were not just evidence. They were proof. But one paper stood out above the rest, a handwritten note from Thomas Bradley, dated October 10th, 1930. The words faded, but still legible, trembled with fear. The man with the suitcase is dead. They found his body today, but I know it wasn't a robbery. Someone killed him for what he knew, and they'll kill me too if they find out I have copies of his documents. I'm hiding these papers and praying that someday, when it's safe, the truth will come out. The American people deserve to know what really happened to their country. For a long time, no one spoke. The past had finally whispered its confession, and it was darker than anyone had imagined. As Sarah Chen made the final digital enhancements to Rothschild's photograph, she couldn't help but think of the man himself. The desperate determination in his eyes, the suitcase pressed tight against his chest. He had carried not just documents, but the burden of truth. It had cost him his life. But his message had survived in a forgotten box in an overlooked archive, waiting for someone to finally listen. Dr. Walsh made her choice. Despite the risks, despite the looming threat of lawsuits and powerful enemies, she decided the story must be told. Edward Rothschild died believing the truth mattered more than his own safety, she told Sarah. The least we can do is make sure his voice is finally heard. Today, the enhanced photograph of Edward Rothschild hangs in the Chicago Historical Society at the heart of an exhibition titled The Price of Truth, Edward Rothschild and the Hidden History of the Great Depression. Visitors can see the original photograph beside the digital reconstruction that revealed the faint words on the suitcase alongside File's letters and notes that shaped one of the most extraordinary investigations in modern historical research. But the most powerful artifact of all is a small placard beside the image bearing Rothschild's own words written in the final days of his life. The American people deserve to know the truth. It's a simple sentence, yet it lingers echoing through the quiet halls of the museum, through the minds of those who stop to read it. It reminds us that history's greatest secrets aren't always buried in grand archives or sealed in government vaults. Sometimes they wait in forgotten corners inside dust-covered boxes until the right moment and the right person brings them into the light. Even now, researchers continue to piece together the fragments Rothschild died protecting. Each new discovery adds another thread to the tapestry revealing the Great Depression, not merely as a story of loss and survival, but as a tangled web of corruption cover-ups and courage that shaped the very soul of America. And it all began with a man, a suitcase, and a photograph that refused to keep its secrets hidden forever.